Good evening, everyone. We'll be starting very shortly. I just wanted to give a couple of minutes for people to roll into the room. And as soon as that is done, we will begin. In the meantime, I'm going to share with you the sponsors of this speaker series.
You guys have a lot of sponsors. That is fantastic.
Now, these are mostly local coalitions throughout Westchester County and Putnam County, all joining forces to access some of the best speakers that we can throughout the nation, like yourself, Dr. Weiner.
Oh, well, that was incredibly kind to say. I was just really marveling at how cohesive you guys are to all come together to do something like this. It's not something that we see everywhere. We're actually just starting something like this up in Illinois, where I'm based out of, but it's amazing to see everyone coming together like this. It's awesome.
Well, Andy learned about it from us, actually.
Oh, I see.
This was all an unintended consequence of COVID that we created. We pooled our resources, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It's 11 coalitions that are either DFC or Partnerships for Success funded. And we pool our resources to hire top-notch speakers.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, when you combine your voice, there's so much that you can do with advocacy too.
Absolutely.
And we have more logos this year, Lisa.
Yeah, we do. More and more joining us.
United.
Well, I do see that we're at the top of the hour, so I want to get started and be mindful of everyone's time. Good evening and welcome to the December edition of the Know to Prevent virtual speaker series. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, Know to Prevent is a collaboration of youth-focused coalitions and agencies in Westchester and Putnam counties working together to provide parents and caregivers with the essential tools to increase resilience and reduce risky behaviors among our youth. For more information about the collaborative and to access previous recordings or presentations, please visit knowtoprevent.org, which you see at the bottom of your screen. Just a couple of housekeeping items. In addition to that, tonight's presentation is being recorded and all participants will receive a link to the recording along with a handout called the tip jar. The tip jar will provide highlights, key takeaways, and information and prompts from tonight's speaker for you to have as a reference. There will also be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so we encourage you to type in any questions you may have along the way into the Q&A box at any time. At this time, I'd like to introduce one of our lead coalition sponsors, Alice Joslow from Ossining Cares Coalition.
Hi, nice to see you all. I'm Alice Joslow from Ossining Communities That Care. We have been in existence since 2004, and our goal is to empower, educate, and enrich, promoting happy, healthy lifestyles for our youth. And our mission is to bring together diverse community partners to foster well-being amongst Ossining's youth, young people, and their families. And we collaborate to maximize opportunities for substance use prevention, and social, academic, and personal growth through innovative, youth-oriented programs right here in Ossining. And I'm so excited to, am I introducing Dr. Weiner now? Okay, I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Weiner. I have seen him present several times, and traditionally our December event is always focused on teen mental health. So of course this year it was like, Dr. Weiner, we're gonna bring him in. He is from Chicago. He's a board certified psychologist and addiction specialist, and he speaks nationally on topics of addiction, behavioral health, and the impact of drug policy on public health. He earned his doctorate from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign and completed his fellowship in addiction psychology at the VA Ann Arbor healthcare system. His perspective is informed by years of experience growing and directing addiction service lines for hospitals and healthcare systems, the current state of medical and psychological research, and his own observations in private practice. He is the president of the Society of Addiction Psychology, a member of the Physician Speakers Bureau for the National Safety Council, and on the Science Advisory Board for Smart Approaches to Marijuana. And I learned just a few minutes ago, he is also an a cappella singer. So, welcome, Dr. Weiner. We are so excited to have you join us and present your presentation. I've seen the slides and it's really wonderful. So thank you.
Oh, well, you're welcome. That was an incredibly kind introduction. And we'll see. My goal for tonight will be to stretch out my slides in the Q&A long enough that I don't have to sing, because it's been several years since I last did that. But I guess we'll see how tonight pans out. Thanks everyone who's taken the time to come tonight. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. We are going to talk about how to cultivate teen mental health as we look forward into 2023 and beyond, specifically around this idea of how do we create stability in a world and a social ecosystem where the rules seem to just be constantly changing, and where when we look at how kids are doing right now, there's definitely some warning signs, some things that we really need to be attentive to and concerned about. And so we'll talk about it both in terms of themes and ways to look at it from a broad perspective, but also ideally leave you guys coming away tonight with some actionable ideas and things that you can actually put into practice if you'd like in your own households. We should have some time for Q&A. That I structured things hopefully so that we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for that. But if we run out of time, please drop me a line. My email is down there in the bottom left, aaron@weinerphd.com. I also have it on the last slide, but I'm happy to be a resource to you. This is a really important topic. And honestly, and we'll talk a bit more about how substance use and mental health and all of this hangs together as we go through the slides tonight. I've found myself focusing more and more and more on teen mental health as time goes on, and certainly over COVID, because in many ways, having really strong coping skills from jump when you're young portends really well in terms of how well you're going to function throughout, honestly, in many ways, the rest of your life. And if you can, as a parent, catch things when they're starting and work on it then and try to help create that sense of stability and resilience, then you might be saving your child a world of trouble and difficulty as time goes on, and truly alter the trajectory of their life for the better. So that's overall the goal for tonight. And yeah, let's go ahead and dive in. We've got a lot to talk about. And we're going to start by just really setting the stage of what's been going on with teen mental health over COVID, which in brief, it hasn't been good news. About half of parents found a new or worsening problem over COVID, a bit more in teen girls than with teen boys. We've seen health insurance claims go up by about 20%. And there's been a couple of studies that really have underscored this. This one by the CDC came out about 6 months ago, I think, and what they were looking at were symptoms of depression in high schoolers. And what they found, unfortunately, was that almost half, 44%, experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, and 1 in 5 seriously considered attempting suicide, which is shockingly high. And this is from a national sample that they were drawing from, very large. So it's definitely data that I would view as reliable. Part of what they found in this study was that how close they felt to people, both at school, that's these bars here on the left, and then virtually on the right, actually was a moderating factor in terms of, or mitigating factor in terms of how depressed they felt. So basically, the shorter the line is, the less depressed they were feeling. And so you can see that the darker lines are all shorter. Those are the kids who felt more connected. So this feeling of being disconnected, of not necessarily having an anchor point, a component of being stable, was a big part of what was driving this depression. We've also seen an increase over time in anxiety, which is what this literature review is looking at. They found that over the course of COVID, about 1 in 5 kids had clinically relevant levels of anxiety. That's twice as high as before the pandemic began, and it's been worsening over time. That's what you're seeing with these dots that are going more and more and more to the right. This is essentially the average prevalence rate of anxiety, with the older studies being at the bottom and the newer studies coming as they were pulling these samples over time. So you can see it's trending very much in the wrong direction. And this is part of what led a number of national groups to declare a national emergency in teen mental health back actually in October of last year. This has been very much on our radars when they saw there was this spike, actually, that's what you're seeing here in this graph, in terms of the proportion of kids who were being admitted to the emergency room for suicidal ideation or attempts. So thinking about suicide or actually attempting it. And this actually was replicated in another study recently that found that these suicide attempts they're up 60% in 2021 compared to previously, which is a lot. Obviously. And then this is all within the context of just everyone being more stressed out than in recent memory. There's every year, the American Psychological Association puts out its Stress in America survey. And in the most recent one that they released about 3 months ago, they found that 1 out of 4 adults said that most days they are so stressed they can't function, which again is a shockingly high percentage for such a strong statement. And a lot of these people are parents. And when parents are stressed out, that definitely influences the kids. There's another study actually that just came out a couple days ago. I didn't have time to put it in these slides, but it actually found that that there's been brain developmental changes. Essentially, kids, when you look at brain aging prior to COVID and then currently, a 16-year-old's brain looks different now than a 16-year-old's brain did 3 years ago, which we don't know yet how that's going to pan out, but that's obviously very concerning news and something that we need to be, again, acutely aware of just as we're working with kids. If anything, it just means that we need to be even more proactive about trying to help equip them and prepare them from an emotional and behavioral point of view, if biologically that they've been through a lot. So where I'd like to start, though, from, again, the parental point of view is trying to look at, so when is my child having a problem? That's a question that I get a lot. So like, what would be a normal reaction to going through this time of really acute, intense stress versus when is someone really responding to it poorly to the point where you need to be concerned? And so I'd like to start there. I think any work we do in terms of trying to improve a problem, you first have to know that the problem is going on in the first place or recognize it as something that requires an intervention. So let's first start with just general signs of emotional distress. We can lump these into 2 main categories of internalizing symptoms and externalizing symptoms. So internalizing symptoms are essentially ways when you feel stress, you're generally either going to kind of like sink into yourself and keep it inside, hence internalizing, or push it outwards, which is what externalizing is about. So how internalizing can look sometimes are academic problems because of difficulty focusing, difficulty sleeping because you're keeping all this tension or energy inside, shutting down. So just kind of seeming like you've got a child who's disconnecting, folding down, withdrawing socially. Sometimes they'll complain about having body-related or somatic problems like headaches or stomach aches, things like that, or excessive time in social media or games. And this is where it's really important to have a gauge on what normal is for your child so you can determine whether or not they're actually increasing the amount they're using, or maybe even if it's just always been very excessive, that would be something to pay attention to in and of itself. We could talk for quite some time just about what's going on with technology, gaming, social media, and young people. But if you're noticing that it seems like they're sinking into another world a lot, or they're really investing in a world that's not the real world, it's worth taking a close look at and examining for the reasons why. Certainly also, if you see a young child engaging in self-harming behaviors, that's a huge red flag. These would be things like if someone's cutting at themselves, burning themselves, things of that nature. Oftentimes that happens because there's a couple of reasons. One that you'll hear a lot is that it's a way of feeling something. So if someone, as a coping mechanism with their stress, is basically numbed out, then causing themselves physical pain is almost like a gateway into feeling something again. Some people also view it as preferable, like I would prefer to feel and focus on physical pain rather than emotional pain. So I'd say those are probably the top two that we hear as therapists or psychologists. Either one of them, though, is a big red flag. If your son or daughter is feeling like harming their bodies is the best way for them to deal with their problems, and is definitely worth paying attention to and getting some help for. Externalizing symptoms can include moodiness and defiance, so acting out towards you if they're using alcohol or other drugs. If they have a really extreme sensitivity to criticism, and this can come when if you have an internal monologue that's pretty harsh, like if you're feeling down about yourself or you're feeling anxious about something, and then you hear that repeated again in the outside world, that's really threatening. That really can shake you up. This is true for both kids and for adults. But when you're talking about a teen, it seems like they're even more sensitive than you'd expect. It's probably because it's interacting with something they've got inside, and it's resonating in a really intense sort of way. If they're acting out, being reckless or self-destructive, being violent, these are all externalizing symptoms that if you see a young person doing these things, either the externalizing or the internalizing, that should be a moment as a parent, have your antenna go up and really think about, this is probably something worth paying attention to. And we'll talk more about what options exist and what you can potentially do to help with this, both at home or working with a professional, but it means that something is up. So specific concerns also to be aware of when you're asking yourself, is there a problem here with my son or daughter that I really ought to pay attention to or even potentially do something about? For depression, you want to be looking at things like negative thinking, expectancies and comments, and statements of low self-esteem. So kind of goes without saying, this is the hallmark of depression, is that you think really negatively, but that also means that it usually will come out of your mouth at some point. And so if it seems like your son or daughter's is very pessimistic all the time, that's something to pay attention to, because it probably reflects that internal monologue, which if it's overly negative, puts them at a disadvantage. If they don't seem to be enjoying activities that they normally would like or passing on them, if they're crying all the time. And then certainly, this is, again, another topic where we can go really deep into it, but we need to talk just for a minute about suicide because the rate has gone up, unfortunately, by so much. Again, about 60% increase, and 1 in 5 kids has seriously thought about it in high school. So we need to be aware of what we should look for here. Some things to pay very close attention to: thought statements or writing about death or suicide, or speaking positively about the impact of their death, like how much easier it'll be if I was gone, or easier it would be on everybody else. That people would be better off, those sorts of statements. It's very normal for people, teenagers and up for that matter, to think about death. It's, just kind of part of the human condition is to reflect at times on our mortality, but it's very different to really dwell on it a lot, and definitely different to think about it positively. Also, something to be aware of if they're giving away things that they value, because then it implies they wouldn't be there to use them. One other sign to watch for is if there seems to be a very quick turnaround when someone's been depressed, and then like all of a sudden it seems like they get better. Sometimes that happens because they've made a decision that they're going to take their own life, and so that feels as if that's like a light at the end of the tunnel, because it creates this sense of relief, even though for the wrong reasons. But it's not that you can't recover from depression. You absolutely can, but it oftentimes doesn't come as like an epiphany where things turn around really quickly. It comes with work and gradually over time. But so if you see a really quick turnaround, I mean, maybe things got better, but definitely pay attention, because it's potentially also a signal that there's something very wrong. On the anxiety front, things to watch for are just a general sense of overwhelm, avoidance of certain activities or groups. If it seems like this is always a reason why your son or daughter can't take part in it, or if they're having just straight up panic attacks where they feel like they need to get out, they might have racing thoughts, heartbeat, sweating a lot, just seem really panicky, perhaps for lack of a better word. But I'd say probably the most common, again, is just this general sense of being tense, overwhelmed, terse, maybe a little bit edgy, always feeling worked up, which again is already really high for kids because of all the pressures of school and achievement and college and everything. But if it seems like it's getting to the point where it's making it hard for them to live their life, or it's actively making it so that they can't perform at school, sleep, they're verbalizing it a lot, that's definitely a time to pay attention. So in terms of eating disorders, which all of these things we're seeing more and more of over COVID. So it's just, again, useful to have your antenna up. It does tend to skew a bit more towards girls than boys, but it's about an 80, 85, 20 percentage split. So just because you have a son doesn't mean that you don't have to think about it. It's definitely possible for them to have an eating disorder as well. The hallmark is a preoccupation with food or their weight, or a dissatisfaction with their body. So again, it's all a continuum. There's a lot of shades of gray in here, body positivity or lack thereof. It's a huge topic these days, particularly with Instagram. And, there's a lot we can talk about in that regard as well. But if it seems like it's become a very intense area of focus, particularly of negative focus, that's worth paying attention to. There's oftentimes an emphasis on control for eating disorders, which is part of why it can be very appealing for kids who feel like their lives are otherwise out of control, which tends to be pretty common for kids anyway. If you just think about the life of a teenager, there's a lot they don't control compared to an adult. There's just a lot of things that are out of their hands at a time when they want to feel more autonomous and they want to have more control over their life. And so if they're feeling that way in an even more extreme sort of way, then feeling like, well, at least I can control what I eat, or I can control my weight, or I can work out and achieve these sorts of results, that can seem very appealing. You might also see them skip meals or engaging in excessive exercise, weight change, obviously, either losing or gaining. Binge eating is another common eating disorder that would oftentimes lead to weight gain as opposed to weight loss. Leaving after meals sometimes is what happens if you've got someone with bulimia. So that's essentially a binging and then purging or vomiting cycle. So they'll eat or eat a lot, and then they'll go immediately throw it up. And so if you see your son or daughter always just leaving after meals and then spending perhaps excessive time in the bathroom, maybe with a fan on or trying to conceal noise, that's definitely something to pay attention to. Additionally, around just a quick subtle sign of bulimia to watch for, if there's a lot of cavities or enamel erosion. If you've got a young person who's vomiting a lot, that absolutely gets after the teeth and can cause cavities more so than would otherwise be there. And then, of course, substance use, which is unfortunately when people are feeling stressed out or depressed at any age, where a lot of people turn to. But kids in particular, they're more susceptible to falling into this trap than most, which is why you have so many great DFCs and other groups in your communities that are trying to prevent youth from going in this direction. Because once you get started, it's a lot harder to stop. Statistically, by their senior year, about 70% of kids have tried alcohol, 50% have used some illegal substance, and we are grouping marijuana and THC products into that. 40% will have vaped or smoked a cigarette, 20% will have misused a prescription of some kind. And this feeds into 8% of the general population having a substance use disorder. 90% of people who have an addiction or a substance use disorder, they start when they're a teenager. And that's part of why we'll touch on this in a little bit in the slides to come, but more about this potentially in another day. But why the marketing for addictive products always tends to skew young, because if 90% of your market has to start in their teenage years to have a chance to keep giving you money for a long time, that's why these industries tend to aim and edge young. And what we've seen on this side of things is a huge increase in vaping in particular. So if we look at 2019 data, so pre-pandemic, because there's a lot of things going on in 2020 and even 2021 that were outside the norm, really where all the red was in the gains was in vaping, both of nicotine and then marijuana, and then some other types of marijuana use, kind of like an outlier there with alcohol. But then actually the most recent data we have shows that these rates are rebounding. They sunk over COVID because kids weren't getting out they didn't have the same access that they did before. But the most recent data that was published, I think this is about 3 months ago, found that now here in the most recent data that we have in I believe this was 2021 data. So when you compare that to 2020 data, it's gone right back up again, 21%. So we're on that upward trajectory. We've also seen the steady increase in young adults using both marijuana and hallucinogens. Again, not a coincidence that these are two areas with a lot of money, venture capital, and new industry growth over the past decade that this is looking at. But our teens roll into this demographic, so it all feeds into the same pot, unfortunately. And again, there's a lot we could talk about on this subject. Just to touch on a couple, though, just to be aware of in terms of why this is so appealing. The flavors are a huge problem that has not yet been solved. Disposable vapes do not have the controls on them that need to be there. So you can buy these very easily. You can have them shipped potentially to your house. The potency also in THC products has gone up a lot over time. It started at about 3 to 4% in the mid-90s. It's this blue line here. And it was 3 to 4% all the way back to Woodstock. But once things started getting commercialized and franchised and industrialized, we started to see the percentage, the concentration go up to the point now where you can't even buy anything that's 3 to 4% THC. Almost everything is over 15% THC. That's the green portions of these pie graphs. This is from a study from a couple of years back. They looked at these 9 legal dispensary markets, and they found that the average in states that had just a medical program was 19% and recreational was 21.5%. So essentially, an average joint of today's recreational marijuana is like lighting up 7 from Woodstock and smoking them all at the same time. So very different product. It's also marketed in very different ways where you've got names like pineapple. Again, we could talk a long time about this, but when you ask yourself, like, who are they really getting at with pot lollipops and gummies and things like that? I mean, it's pretty clear where all of this is aimed. And this idea of a market that's springing up to try to meet this increasing demand to deal with stress, or maybe in some cases with kids to try to find social acceptance in certain groups, it's all across the board. We're seeing it in gaming and in gambling. It's rising because there's these industries that are trying to like fill this demand, unfortunately, that we have as a society right now. But it begs the question of why do we choose, quote unquote, to cope poorly? Because that's all, pretty much everything in the past 5 slides is like all of that: substance use, eating disorders, self-harming behavior, internalizing and externalizing. All it is you're feeling this tension inside and you're trying to deal with it somehow. But the ways that you're doing it cause you more problems and harm over time. And so, you'd think so, like, why do we do it then? Like, what's the point in it? Why wouldn't we choose something that's better? Well, it's because ultimately it's very difficult to be sitting with discomfort when it seems like there's a solution available. An experiment that was done many years ago that I think is a good metaphor for this is the marshmallow experiment. And if you're not familiar with this, essentially you take a young child, you put them down in front of a couple of marshmallows and tell them you can either eat these marshmallows now, or if you can wait with them for 10 minutes, then I will give you 10 more marshmallows. And so the idea here is that it's in their best interest to wait because they get the larger reward. And are they going to do it? The problem, and why this is so hard for young kids, is that they are currently sitting at a 0 marshmallow state in their tummies, right? They have no marshmallows. So the difference of 0 to 2 is a lot. And we tend to do something called delay discount or temporal discounting, where we care much more about what we can get right now than what we're going to get 10 minutes, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month in the future, or say the consequences that are going to happen 1 day, 1 month, 1 year in the future. And part of this, and part of why kids are so susceptible to this, is because of how our brain is designed. And the best diagram I could find to represent the human brain is this one, where you have a dog driving a Tesla, which seems like a weird analogy to make, but I promise it makes sense. The car, so the Tesla here, is like it's our cerebral cortex. It's the advanced part of our brain. It's part of what allows us to do things that animals can't do. It's where our personality sits, actually, but it's also where we have this whole range of skills called executive functions. So this includes planning, being able to multitask or task switch, to synthesize big ideas and put them together, to moralize. Motivation to some extent comes from there. But that's as strong as that part of our brain is, it's as advanced as it is less strong than our more primal animalistic brain, otherwise known as the limbic system. The limbic system is the part of our brain where emotions and urges come from. And it's like a dog driving our car, because when it gets activated, it takes the wheel, and what it wants more than anything else is to not feel pain. Does not want to be uncomfortable. That's the number one thing that animals don't want. When they have an uncomfortable state, they want it to get better. They want to eat food. They want to get out of pain. They don't like discomfort. And we have that part in our brain too. The second thing that part of our brain wants is pleasure. So avoid pain, priority 1, seek out pleasure, priority 2. So when you think about what we were talking about before, between substance use, avoiding certain situations, all of that, there are these very short-term solutions to these problems that can immediately resolve discomfort. And that's oftentimes how it works. When we get activated, actually, we can tell from brain scans that the prefrontal cortex actually shuts down. That's part of why, like, if you think about when you're really angry or when you're really stressed out, you're like really focused on that one particular problem. You stop being like open and expansive in your thinking, and it tends to condense, and all you could think about is what you're angry about or what you perceive as the threat. That's because, like if the threat were like a lion and you were trying to stay alive in the Serengeti, like that would keep you alive. The problem is that's the only way our brain knows how to deal with stress. And for kids in particular, though, and this is where it comes back to that marshmallow thing, the prefrontal cortex, so that part of the brain that has to do with that's the Tesla part. That's the part that understands logic and reason. It's actually the last part of our brain to fully develop. It's not totally done until you're 25, essentially, depending on what you read, 25 to 28. But it's one of the last parts to develop. So whatever control or influence we want to have our prefrontal cortex have over our impulses, that's developing over time. That's why when you think about adolescents and teens and even young adults, they tend to be more impulsive and risk-taking, driven more by those urges and feelings in the moment. Part of that's just because their brain isn't done cooking yet. It's still getting to the point where you've got all your faculties. Even then, I mean, goodness gracious, like it's very difficult for a lot of people, for a lot of adults to work with those urges and feelings, and to have the car part take more control than just the dog taking the wheel all the time when you get into a moment of stress. But ultimately, when we think about why our kids are acting the way they are, even when it seems like why would they possibly do that? How could they make sense? I think a lot of times it's easy just to have that be the end of it and just think like, wow, like that was a terrible idea, or what were they thinking? There is actually an answer to that question. And this is going to be a theme throughout our conversation today as well, which is that behavior is always purpose-driven, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. We're always trying to meet some need. I mean, when we talk about where do mental health problems come from, it's people trying to meet their needs and to feel better, usually just in ways that don't actually help. Like someone's feeling anxious about social situations, they tend to avoid those situations to make themselves feel better. Does it help? No. I mean, in the moment it does, I guess, because they're avoiding that feeling of tension inside, but does it fix their social anxiety? Nope. No, absolutely not. But it's serving a purpose. Same thing with drug use, same thing with eating disorders. So we have to understand the reason why. That's a really critical element of this, is that in terms of how do we work with our own kids and their mental health. And this is the part where like we can talk all day about ideas and themes and tactics. And we will for the next hour or so. But ultimately, when it comes to your child in your house, that's where you've got to take the principles and apply them, because it's different for everybody. And so that's a good segue into a question of, so how can we help? What can we do as parents to try to help kids through this difficult time when their dog is more likely to grab the wheel of their car, and when we already know, at least from statistics, that kids are struggling more now than they are in general? The number one thing that you can do is show them that you are an emotionally safe person. And the word I used up here for the title is demonstrate, or demonstrating emotional safety. And I chose that word very intentionally, because safety is something that you can't tell someone, you have to show them. And that's another nuance about that dog and car model, which I'll come back to quite a bit today probably, is that dogs, they don't understand words, not really. I mean, right? Like when you teach a dog to sit, you know, the way you reinforce that is with treats. You say sit, you push their butt down, you give them a treat. Eventually they learn they're going to get a treat when they hear those phonemes and sit. It's based on the feeling, and the limbic system in our brain learns through experiences, through being shown, not through being told. That's part of why if someone's really upset about something and you say, don't worry, it's going to be fine, that does zero, right? Like it's never been like, oh, they're never like, you know what? I'm so glad you dismissed my feelings and told me that my worries are unnecessary. I believe you. But no, right? That literally never happens. And it's because you can't tell safety, you show safety. And it works that way through almost every emotion and urge. You have to speak the language of the part of the brain you're trying to get at, or it's not going to listen. So when you are trying to be an emotionally safe person to your child, you have to show it consistently and repeatedly. And the best way to do that is how you speak to them. And there's a model called Communicate with Love. I did not make this up, so I won't take credit. I just think it's a really good model about how you can communicate to demonstrate emotional safety. Love stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. So let's start with listening. So listening means active listening. So asking open-ended questions and reflecting things back to the person, to your child who you're talking to show them that you're listening. People don't assume that you're listening just because you're physically there. You actually have to show them, and you could do that in a lot of ways. You know, some of it's eye contact and body posture, but a lot of it is how you respond to them. So it's not like they're just monologuing at you. And what these things can do, so open-ended questions are questions that someone can't answer with just like a simple yes, no, good, fine, that sort of thing. It's the difference between a how was your day at school today? Fine, versus what was the most interesting thing that happened to you at school today? Or what was the most challenging thing that you're going through at school right now? Or hey, like tell me more about geometry. Like what's going on in that class? They're questions that actually ask for detail and not only give another person a chance to share more, but it shows them that you're interested in what they have to say, which is something that, again, if you don't already have this relationship with your child, is really important to ask. I mean, they don't necessarily have to take you up on it, but even just asking shows I care about you. Reflecting something means that when someone talks to you, you reflect it back to them in different words. So to show them that you've taken in their meaning and you're giving it back to them in a different way, which if you didn't understand them, you couldn't do. So like if we keep going with the geometry example, if you've got if you've got like your son and he gets into the car and says like, oh man, you know, like I got a C in my geometry test and I'm, you know, and I studied so hard. If you respond to him by saying something like, oh gosh, that must be so frustrating. I know how hard you worked on that. You're showing that you heard, also reflecting back an emotion there, saying that you understand the feeling that he was trying to convey. That shows someone that you're listening. So you don't want to take it for granted. You want to show someone that you're listening, that you care. The O stands for offering, or more specifically, how do you offer feedback, which is a trap that a lot of parents fall into, because in some ways it is our job to help guide and advise our kids. But particularly when kids get to be teenagers, they want to feel like they've, again, got agency and control and autonomy. And so feeling like you're being directed or like pointed around by your parents actually cannot feel very good. A mantra you can think of here that I may even have somewhere else on this slide, or another one, is that if you push, they can push back. So if you're not pushing, then they can't push back. And so the way that you can provide guidance without pushing is with a technique called a feedback sandwich. And so what that means is that you're sandwiching the guidance, it's like the meat of the sandwich, between two slices of autonomy. So what I mean by that is that you start, so the first chance for your child to show that they have control over where they go is you actually ask permission to share your opinion. Now, sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes you really do need to give feedback in the moment. It might be very important. But if it's something where someone is being vulnerable with you, if your child is being vulnerable with you and you have an opportunity to ask, you can literally say like, hey, it's like I've had some experience with this. Can I tell you what it was like for me? Or I have some ideas, but you'd like to hear my opinion. What happens there is that if they say yes, and if they don't say yes, that needs to be okay, right? You got to show them that they have that autonomy. But if they do say yes, that means that they've literally asked for the advice, which means it's the opposite of you pushing it on them or telling them what's right and what's wrong. They've literally said, sure, tell me. So they've asked for your opinion. Then you provide it, you provide the information, and then afterwards, that other slice of autonomy is ask for their reaction. And you can even tell them explicitly, like, it's okay to disagree. Like, I'd love to hear how you feel about this. Does this resonate with you? What do you think? And so what happens then is that if you use this model of the feedback sandwich, you are not pushing, and the person you're speaking to, in this case, your child, but this also works with adults, they feel like they're much more likely, and we know this from research, they're much more likely to actually take the guidance and use it on their own because they take ownership over it. They asked for the advice, and they themselves said that they agree with the advice. So it feels very different than being like, my mom told me this, or my dad told me that. Completely different vibe. And particularly for high school students, this in high school kids rather, it really helps a lot. The V in the model stands for validating, where essentially it's what it sounds like, you are validating someone else's feelings and just telling them that like it's okay to feel the way you're feeling, which for kids, it reinforces their self-efficacy, their self-trust in their own judgment and their own gut. And again, that's because no one likes to be discounted. You know, like you may have a teenage daughter or son who's just absolutely devastated because they broke, you know, that they just had their first breakup with their first boyfriend or girlfriend. And from your perspective, you're like, okay, you know, like maybe you weren't too big a fan of them anyway. Everybody's immature, very few high school relationships that work out fine anyway, a lot of fish in the sea, or like whatever you're thinking of from your adult perspective. But saying that does absolutely nothing, at least at first, right? Because they're feeling heartbroken, they lost something. And so really just getting in there, validating that it's so hard to lose something or to work hard for it or to feel betrayed or whatever the feeling is, it's really important to validate that feeling. Otherwise, people stop trusting how they feel inside from a younger age. And it's actually really important to be connected to that. We'll talk more about connection in a few minutes. And then the E of the model stands for empathizing. To borrow a phrase here from Brene Brown, you want to get in a hole with someone. If someone's in a deep, dark hole, you don't want to just ride in like, you know, like a white knight on a horse and like throw him on the back and carry him to safety. People actually don't really like that so much. What they want is to be seen, validated, empathized with, and then you walk with them somewhere new. You show them that you care, that you're there, and that you can understand, and that they are okay. And then you help them or you offer advice. So listen, offer, validate, and empathize. These are, if there are 4 principles to remember in terms of communication, these are really good ones. And this is how you create that emotional safety, which if you do this over and over and over, particularly again, if you don't have this right now, this is how you show it. Again, this is not something, creating an emotionally safe relationship is not something that you can tell. It's not something that happens overnight if it's not there. It's something that you can show over time. So it's really important as well to have persistence and not get discouraged if this doesn't happen immediately. Because again, you're truly trying to get at somebody's heart here, not at their logic, not at their brain, but at their feelings. And that takes speaking a different language, the language of experience. So I want to move now into this construct then. If this is the base, emotional stability, emotional safety rather, We need to be able to create this emotionally safe environment. How do we cultivate stability? And I'm going to define that as having three parts, and we're going to talk about each of them separately. Emotional stability comes from a sense of connection, from confidence, and from structure. And we're going to go through each of these now and talk about how you can enhance these with your teens to create that sense of stability, which again is very. We'll get at this a little bit more in the structure section, which is where we're going next, actually. But when everything seems like it's moving and changing, and there's a lot of political unrest or questions, in some cases about safety or about school lockdowns or about viruses or whatever else is going on, trying to create a sense of stability can be very difficult. So one of the first pillars is structure. And what I mean by structure has to do with having routines and predictability in life. We thrive from this as human beings, which is something that it's not to say that variety is bad in some way or that we shouldn't have a varied life. We should. But the question is, what is the foundation from which we are reaching out experientially and emotionally? Young people in particular actually tend to be more anxious when they have to create their own structure. That actually creates more problems. And part of why when we talk about parenting styles, if you're too hands-off, that's actually not helpful. It's like you're always trying to strike that balance, right? The authoritarian, really intense, rigid, not going with that love model parenting has some negative outcomes, as does being overly permissive and hands-off. What you want is to create this strong foundation where they've got routines and predictability, but then the choice to reach further and beyond that. So you present them with these opportunities coming from this place of structure where they can feel safe within it. They know what their day holds. They know emotionally how you're going to be. That's part of why when someone's world is chaotic, when parents are chaotic or emotionally unstable themselves, or environments are chaotic or feel unsafe, why that breeds dysregulation within the people who live inside of it. And you can kind of think of this as like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs sort of deal. If you're not familiar with this, the idea is that you have to meet your basic needs of like food, water, warmth, and rest, safety needs, before you can meet your psychological needs of belongingness and esteem, before you can meet your actualization needs. So achieve your potential, be creative. And so this, I think it's very easy at times for us to take for granted that people are having these psychological needs met, that the kids in particular are having these psychological needs met, when that might not actually be the case. The structure has gotten very wiggly, or because of just the situation that we're in right now in the world, it feels like the parameter and the structure is starting to shift. So places that you can think of in terms of stability, just ideas to consider about, if you're asking yourself, does my son or daughter feel like they've got good routines and predictability? How would they answer that question? Or even asking them about it. Things that you can start to target to create this sense are things like their schedules. When do they get up? When do they go to sleep? What are they doing during the day? Do they have big chunks of unscheduled time? Like, for example, latchkey kids tend to do emotionally worse than those who are in environments where there's strong, stable adult support and role models. Is discipline stable? Do kids know when they're going to be rewarded? Do they know when there's going to be negative consequences? Or does it seem like mom does one thing, dad does another? I don't know what I'm going to get away with. Or does it seem like they know where those boundaries are? Are we meeting their basic psychological needs in terms of, in particular, again, just right off the chart, do they feel like they belong, like their parents love them and celebrate them? Do they have friends? Are they feeling like they have some sense of mastery and accomplishment in any place in their life? If these things aren't there, it's worth trying to create that structure, create that stability, maybe moving in different directions or reprioritizing where you're spending your time. Rituals and traditions can also be really helpful for this, in terms of things that the family does every week on a certain night. It can be a TV show. It can be a spiritual or religious event. It can be any number of different things, but just something that a young person can look forward to. where they feel like, again, like this is the general framework of my life, and I can feel comfortable and secure that my needs are going to be met. And from that, when I want to try experimenting with, a different hairstyle or a different activity or whatever it is, there's a misconception in some ways that creating something that's stable and routinized will make kids cognitively inflexible, or that they won't be able to adapt to change or new things. It's actually the opposite. If they don't have stability, they become insecurely attached, and they are less likely to reach out, and they're more likely to have more problems. So it's about, again, it's not about locking a child down, but it's about creating that stable sense of foundation, and like they're being held, like they can rely on something. And then from there, they branch out. So a way to think about this as well in terms of behavior is to, when you've got a child who's acting poorly, in terms of their dynamics at home, you can think of behaviors, and if someone's acting out, as just being like the tip of an iceberg, and that they're trying to communicate something to you. I really like Stuart Shanker's self-reg model for this. If you haven't heard of him, you can look him up online. He's got some online resources. He's also published a book on it. But basically, his central thesis is that when kids are acting out, it's because they're overwhelmed trying to deal with a lot of different problems in different domains. It could be the biological domain, so just things that are going on in their environment, sensory stimuli. It can be cognitive, so having to think through things or process their environment. Emotional, so the emotional needs of themselves and others. Social stressors, and then pro-social stressors, so what's expected of them by their family and by society. And so when you see something that's unexpected or which feels like bad behavior, it means that they're getting overwhelmed. They're spending all of their energy trying to deal with all of this stuff, and they can't regulate it out. The structure essentially is not set in such a way where they feel stable. And so then when they get another curveball, it can push them over the top. And so part of what this model tells us is that it's most important to focus on the why of behavior, not the what. So if you've got a child who is using substances, or you've got a child who is exhibiting eating disorder behaviors, whatever it is, these maladaptive coping strategies, recognize that there's a reason for it. Again, there's a purpose behind all of it. What's the reason why? But then speak to that need. And it might have to do with connection, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also with structure. And it's this question of, are we able to regulate ourselves? Can we, when we're getting really worked up, come back down, rather than constantly having this self-control to hold back our impulses? There's a question of like, if we are regulated, the impulses stop pushing us in the same sort of way. We don't have to control ourselves because we know how to bring ourselves up and then back down again. And a lot of that comes again from how we structure our lives around all of these different domains. So I think I've got his book cited on one of the last slides around future resources, but really worthwhile reading, whether the book or just online there. So other dynamics to watch for at home, things that I've noticed just structurally cause problems. So if we talked before about what creates positive structure, these are things that oftentimes create negative structure, structural elements. So the first would be something called enabling. And enabling is when essentially, as parents, you allow a negative behavior to persist because if you weren't there supporting it, it couldn't continue. An example that we see in slightly older folks, teenagers to an extent, but this is where it goes, is kind of like there's like an archetypal 25-year-old overweight male living in his parents' basement, playing video games and smoking pot. And we see a lot of these folks. And this archetype could not exist without the parents' support, right? That's where the food and the money and everything else is coming from. And so a lot of times as parents, we can be afraid to let our children fail or experience discomfort or the natural negative consequences of their own actions. It's important to let that happen. Again, stable foundation, but when someone's doing something that might elicit negative consequences, it's important that we actually let that happen and that we allow them then to learn from it. avoidance and fear of your child. Hopefully none of you are in this cycle at the moment, but there's a lot of families, a lot of parents who I talk to. I see this actually a lot around technology, where the idea of like taking the iPad away at the end of the day, or of the phone going away, it's just going to be a fight, so I don't even try anymore. Or like I don't want to even go down that road. It's just a problem. That creates problems, huge problems, because again, no structure around whatever the behavior is, technology related or not. And at that point, that's when the young person is actually running the house, because it's just like, it's kind of like emotional blackmail. Either you do what I say or I throw a fit, and you don't want that, right? But the problem is that there's a phrase that I heard once that really stuck in my mind of, what you permit, you promote. And so if you allow something to continue and to repeat over and over and over again, they're going to learn, this is how I meet my needs. That's the structure of their life. So if you see a cycle going on that's negative, as a parent, it's worth taking a step back and asking yourself, do I have a role in perpetuating this? And if so, is it related to enabling? Is it because I'm afraid of this situation, or I just want to avoid it? And if so, then address it. Another really destructive dynamic is parental splitting. So when, again, mom is doing one thing, the dad is doing another, when the two co-parents are not giving the same message, and then the child plays them off each other. Really important to be on the same page as your parenting partner. Normalizing chaos or having a lack of consequences. So this is another aspect where there's just no boundaries, right? And things happen, and it's just like, oh, kids will be kids, or there's something happens, and there's parents are so busy that they don't take the time to really set those boundaries, express expectations. Really important that you do that. It can also then have a negative impact on the other children in the house, where they see their older brother or sister doing it, and then they might want to do it themselves. They might be neglected if their older brother or sister is getting all the attention because of that acting out behavior, and it creates this situation of chronic stress. So to bring us back to the positive here as we end in this section, if you provide structure, it creates security, and it's the launch pad for a positive identity development. That's this top of the pyramid. That's self-actualization, where you figure yourself out, where you figure out what you like, what you want, where you move forward in your life. The structure around the basic and psychological needs is what creates that. So when we're trying to create this stability, really making sure that we've provided a solid structure is really important. The second category is connectivity. So is a young person connected to a few different areas in their life? And we're going to start with the most obvious definition of connectivity, that being social connectivity. Are they actually socializing with others and learning those skills? We are, I know this is cliche to say, but it's true, we are social creatures, and it's really important that we're not alone all the time. It's not to say that there aren't introverts. And I suppose if you have a child who is legitimately thriving emotionally and just never really wants to hang out with other people, maybe that's okay. But by and large, it's a balance. Even if you're introverted, doesn't mean that you never want to see folks. So having actual FaceTime is really important, not just being behind the screen, behind a screen all the time. It looks like I'm going to have a bunch of bullets coming up here all at once, but bear with me. So have them be a part of the household, not apart from the household. So really try to leverage the family unit to your advantage. That might even mean, like I've got in this picture, like going to where your kids like to be. So learning to play the games they like to play, not just asking them to do what you're doing or just doing your own thing at night because you guys like different things. It's really worthwhile taking an interest in what your child likes and showing that to them. It says to them, I care about you and what you care about, and I want to understand you and be part with you. You also really want them to have other healthy adult role models in their life, not just parents. Again, whether or not children verbalize it, they are looking at older people for examples about how to be, in a very broad sense of the word, how to act at home, how to act in society, how they should be behaving, the actions that they soak everything in, dynamic with a romantic partner, all of it. So like what you model and having positive adult role models is really important, not just necessarily also what they're picking up from the media, because those might not be the most healthy role models. On the behavioral standpoint, There's a lot we could talk about with this, but essentially our brain is actually always looking at our bodies for cues about how it should feel, and it can create cycles. So as an example, the first rule of depression treatment is don't act depressed, which sounds kind of obvious, but it's oftentimes really hard to break out of that cycle if you're stuck in a depressive cycle. So like if depression means isolating and spending a lot of time in your room, you got to get people out and going. But making sure that kids understand like what behaviors make them feel better about themselves, which make them feel worse. Can we talk about these things? Can they express them? Are they aware of them? Or are they just kind of going along with wherever they're pushed or forces are acting on them, as opposed to making active choices with their behaviors that improve and sustain their mental health? And then on the emotional side, emotional connectivity is really important. Can we express how we feel? Are we connected to our emotions, or are we just numbing them out? Or do they seem to explode on us and take us and carry us away? If we can't talk about it or relate to them in a healthy way, it can create problems down the line and unhealthy ways of expressing them, like self-harm or eating disorders or substance use. So connection provides self-understanding. Ultimately, when we are connected to ourselves and others, that helps us define who you are. And then for young people in particular, who you want to be. They're seeing that, where you belong, what environments and people and peer groups do I identify with? Where do I want to be and where do I not? What do I like to do? Have I gotten out there and connected with all these things that I can get involved in to figure out what I want to do with my life? And why you feel the way you do, without that typo at the end. When you understand why you feel the way you do, that empowers you then to do the things that promote that in yourself moving forward, so that you can navigate your emotional world, which ultimately is different for all of us. And again, I'm an actively practicing therapist, and I would say that that is one of the most common tasks that I have to do with my clients, is just really dig in and start to think about, so how do these elements of your life affect you? Are you just doing what you've always done? Or does it seem like maybe there's some room for trying some things that are different, get a different outcome, because you are a person who reacts this way to this thing? So the last arm of this is building inner strength through confidence. So how do you create confidence? Confidence comes from real life experiences confirming positive beliefs and not from logic. So confidence is another one of these dog emotion, urge. It's a feeling, right? Feelings do not come from the logic side of our brain. You can't talk someone into being confident. Not really, not like at their core. Someone feels confident by doing and seeing that their positive belief about themselves is true. So say, for example, you've got someone who's afraid of public speaking. How do they get over it? They talk over and over and over again. And they might see, even when they're nervous, they do okay. And then the more they do it, the less anxious they feel. And that's how they start to feel confident speaking in public. It's not from doing some sort of like mental gymnastics and thinking of the audience in their underwear. I mean, maybe that helps you get over the hump to get on stage in the first place. It's about doing and having that information, that experience is what speaks to that part of our brain. So confidence comes from doing, not from logic. We also want to work within our circle of influence. I'm going to borrow this from Stephen Covey. What this essentially is referring to is that we all have a circle of concern, things that we care about in this world. But then there's a lot of, we can't affect all of it. There's so many things in our life that we can't impact, so many things we're worried about or concerned about. What we can do, though, is affect things within our circle of influence, maybe what goes on in our own house or our own community, our own school, or my grade on this test, or even maybe just how hard I study, right? Because sometimes studying doesn't lead to grades, but your process you can influence. The model here and how this builds confidence is that the more you invest in your circle of influence, that's that proactive focus here on the left. Actually, it tends to help because you can influence it, but then your circle of influence tends to expand. You tend to become more influential, the more you invest in the things you actually can control, versus really putting a lot of energy and worry and concern into things outside your circle of influence that you can't control. That is wasted energy and tends to shrink your circle of influence because you start becoming anxious, outwardly focused, and you can't do anything about it. You just get all this feedback over and over and over that you can't accomplish your goals. So this has to do with study, practice, and then actually doing things, working within the circle of influence so that it expands and you feel confident in your abilities because you're seeing evidence of it in the real world. This comes from a mindset shift of, can I do something in the first place, to how can I do this? Where we just assume, yeah, like, of course, this is possible. It's possible to get a good grade on this test. It's possible to make the varsity team. It's possible, whatever it is that you're looking to do. The question is just about how, not about if you're actually capable. And that's eventually when you start becoming confident, what that starts to look like, where you've really internalized, I have efficacy. I've done things, I've seen a positive outcome, and I know that it's possible for me to accomplish my goals. So how am I going to do that in this situation? The understanding of the why, so the intellectual around confidence, like, again, that studying part about it helps, but confidence comes from doing. I can't stress that enough. Confidence comes from practice, doing something that's inside your circle of influence so that you get that positive feedback. So to give you an example about how this works, I'm going to give you a quick overview of how anxiety and stress actually functions and how doing resolves it. So, and I'll go through this a little bit quickly because I'm glancing at the time. I know we want about 20 minutes for questions and we're coming up on it there. So I want to make sure I don't take away from that. And we've touched on some of this slide already, so we'll go a little bit quicker. But essentially, anxiety and stress, as I mentioned before, it's meant to be helpful. It's like focusing on a danger, right? The more you focus in on something that's dangerous, theoretically, the better you'll be able to react to it. However, it doesn't actually work that way in modern life because our body only knows how to get like attention in our stomach, help us be hyper-focused and not sit still, which isn't helpful, say, like if you're studying for a test or sitting for a test. That actually ends up being a negative influence, even though your body's trying to help you out. We define stress as being biological and physical. So that's like tension, and it's driven by nervous system activation. Anxiety is the psychological side to it. It's those thoughts about, how's this going to go? This is going to be terrible. What's she going to think of me? What if I flunk this test? The whole idea of that is, well, and this again might not be conscious, although when you dig in, that's what's going on, is that if I worry about it, I'll be better prepared. That's kind of the underlying assumption. If I worry about it, I'll prepare more, I'll be more careful about it. It might work out better, or maybe I'll just avoid it entirely because I'm so anxious, which then would relieve that sense of discomfort. And these things tend to flow into each other. Now, the thing about avoidance, which is a really common response to being anxious about something, is that it feels really good because immediately whatever it is that you're anxious about disappears. So in the moment, if you choose to avoid something, like not go into that new social environment, or not ask somebody out to the dance, or whatever it is, that can feel really good, but it locks anxiety into place because you don't have the experience of seeing that it'll actually be okay. And so we call avoidance and similar behaviors like this a safety behavior, something you do that keeps you safe, or you think rather keeps you safe because something bad doesn't happen, but what doesn't allow you to learn that it's safe the whole time. An example of this is like a security blanket. Like if you've got a young child who goes to sleep every night with a security blanket, and every morning, or rather, and they do that because they think that there's a monster under their bed and that they're going to get, eaten overnight, or going to lose an arm or something. And they know that this blanket works because every night they go to sleep with the blanket. Every morning they wake up with all their fingers and toes. Then they say, ergo, like the security blanket works. I need this every night. It keeps me safe. And I'm afraid of the dark. Now, of course, right, we know there's no monster. The dark is safe, but they don't think they're safe because there's no monster. They think that they're safe because of the blanket. That's a safety behavior or a safety object. But what happens when you take the blanket away? Well, at first they're going to be super anxious about it, right? Because they think they're going to get eaten. The blanket was what was keeping them safe. But the first day they wake up and they're fine. Okay, it's like this new information. They just did something. They just had an experience. And that starts to make an impact. They might feel stressed again for the next couple of nights, but eventually it's going to start to sink in. Wait a second, that blanket was doing nothing. The blanket was doing nothing, and the environment is what was safe. And that's basically what anxiety treatment is all about. It's about experiencing safety, linking back to that love slide, right? You experience safety, and that's what allows you to feel safe. So whenever we have emotions that are not going in a direction that's helpful to us, we have to experience our way out of that. And that's why, again, when we're talking about confidence, we get confidence by doing, by facing our fears, by learning new skills, by trying something out and seeing a positive result. Confidence provides an emotional foundation for action and growth because you feel like you can do it. It can provide initiative to correct imbalances. So if you feel like something is off in your life, you can think, I can fix this. That's confidence. That's self-efficacy. That's saying something's wrong, but I am capable of fixing it. It creates that sense of conviction and an intrinsic sense of safety and of security. Because again, even if something goes wrong, I know I'm going to be okay. And so getting back to our model from the beginning, when we're thinking about how do we create the stability for our teens, it has to do with creating a structure to hold and be that foundation and springboard, connection to their social world, to their behavioral world, and then also their inner emotional world. And then confidence through doing, through learning, through experience, that they have self-efficacy, that they have agency, and that they can believe in themselves. So what can you do if you think you need help? If this is something where your child is really struggling at a point where you really feel like you need something to step in and help at least provide a structure to move forward. Some recommendations for you. These are some apps that I really like. Meditation can actually be very helpful, and mindfulness, and Headspace has great resources specifically designed for teens that are a little bit easier to get into than others. So that's a great app if mindfulness and meditation is useful. If a gratitude practice would have some utility, and this doesn't have the words with it, but it's an app called the 5-Minute Journal. And I really like that one for infusing some gratitude in 5 minutes in the beginning and end of the day. A lot of great evidence around gratitude and positive psychology. Similarly, there's an app called Happify, which does a very good job of actually gamifying a lot of really good cognitive behavioral principles and getting kids working in ways that help to challenge some beliefs that might be holding them back. Some books, most of these more for you than for your child, but very useful. This is that book by Dr. Shanker called Self-Reg. Another book that I really like, Unwinding Anxiety. Again, this is one that would probably be more for your benefit, and then passing it on. It's written for an adult, or a teenager would get a lot out of it if they're patient and they like to read. Very good book, actually probably one of my favorites in the past 2 years, but really helps folks understand where does anxiety come from, and stress, and how do we work to start to make it better. For emotional intelligence, this is my #1 recommendation, Permission to Feel by Dr. Mark Brackett. He has actually his own training curriculum, much like Dr. Shanker, around emotional intelligence. And this book, again, is written for adults, but is something that you can use when working with your child. And then lastly, and I've mentioned this a couple of times on the slide, because mindfulness is one of the best skills, honestly, transdiagnostic. It's useful for a bunch of different stuff that anyone can learn, including teens. This book is written for teenagers and so in a way that's meant to be engaging, and it helps get them into this skill if it's something that they're open to trying. Now, if things are getting really dicey, it's absolutely worth working with a therapist. I promise you, we don't bite. We come in person and virtual flavors, so we've never been easier to access in that way. It is not a referendum on you as a parent. If you work with a therapist, I think that's a barrier that stops a lot of parents and families from getting help that they really could use. If you learned anything tonight, that's because I'm a professional in this, and I spent a lot of time studying it, and I read articles and journal articles about it all the time. And we're here to help you. You know, that's literally what we're here for. So please don't, if it's something where you're noticing a lot of very concerning symptoms from some of the earlier slides, please don't be afraid to reach out. We really are here to help. And also, again, just a plug from actually working with a therapist, it's very different than do-it-yourself models, which isn't to say that the apps and the books can't be helpful, but much like watching a video about physical therapy is very different than actually having someone right there with you to make sure you're doing the movements right, giving you coaching, being with you every step of the way. That's the same way that therapy works. So it's absolutely worth, if things are not going in a positive direction, reaching out for that help. In terms of finding a therapist, these are the top 3 places to find them where you can put in your insurance. Mental Health Match and Therapy Den are probably my 2 favorites. Psychology Today is massive and has everyone in it, but I think harder to potentially find the person who's actually best for you. But this is where I'd look if you're trying to find a therapist. If you've got an emergency, just a couple of things to mention, because I feel like we got to put it out there when we're talking about mental health. If there's just an outright mental health emergency, if someone's either getting violent or you're worried about their well-being, call 911. That's actually what they're there for. That's what psychiatric hospitals are there for. If you're in danger or someone's in danger, call that. 988, you might have heard about, new national line, fantastic resource. It's a suicide and crisis lifeline. If you are in an emergency, they're just going to connect you to 911 though. So you might as well just skip straight to 911. If things are if you're just getting really, you don't know which way to turn and you feel like you're in crisis, but it's not an emergency, 988 is a fantastic now national resource. I think it was just released about 4 to 6 months ago. So worth knowing about that and letting people know about that. Another resource you may or may not be aware of is 211. This is another national line where if you're looking for resources in whatever area you're in, although I know that most folks tonight are probably from a particular area of New York, this is a free hotline as well that can help connect you to resources. So just to sum everything up, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. Our kids need our support now more than ever. And so what we can do about this, stay tuned into your child. If you know what normal looks like, you'll know when it changes. So again, if that connection and staying connected with them, talking to them so that you can tell if any of those warning signs are new and emerging is really important. Keep them in mind, get help if necessary. And for the core of the topic tonight, emotional stability comes from emotional safety, which you create through repetition and communication. And then structure, connection, and confidence, all of which can be built at home. And if you need help, again, please reach out. The resources are here. So thank you guys again for your time and attention tonight. Here's my contact information one more time. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like. I'm also very responsive over social media, so feel free to connect with me there as well if you'd like. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our hosts.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Weiner. Before we dive into the Q&A, which I'm sure people are waiting anxiously for, we have some great questions. We would appreciate everyone's feedback. So I'm going to share my screen super quickly. If you would open your camera on your phone and point it at the QR code, it'll take you directly to the survey. We will also be emailing a link to this survey in the email that you will receive with the tip chart and a recording of the presentation tonight. It's very short, less than a minute, but it provides us with a lot of valuable feedback and helps guide our future programming. So we thank you in advance. We also invite you to join our January webinar on youth marijuana use. What do we know and what should we do with Dr. Kevin Gray? You can use this QR code to visit the website and register, or you can go directly to the website at any time. So at this time, I would like to turn it over to Alice to start with the Q&A.
Great. And Lisa, if you could put Dr. Weiner's email into the chat too, that would be good, because I assume we're going to get rid of the slides just because I think people would like to go to his website.
No problem.
So thank you so much. And what I love about this presentation is you gave us so much information in terms of the structure, connection, and confidence, and the whole communicating with love. And, usually you see presentations with lots of statistics, but you actually give us bite-sized chunks of what we can do to support our teams. So thank you for that.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure.
The first question I'm going to ask is, if you have a particularly anxious child or a child who has experienced some trauma it can be hard to get them to take that first risk, to try something hard that allows them to experience that feeling of being okay, getting to that confidence moment. I can handle this. Are there good baby steps you could share to get into that?
Mm. That is a really good question. And I think it might have something to do with different domains. So I think just like off the top of my head, I'm having a hard time pulling one out. But one thing that comes to mind though is that this is an area, and I think part of why right now we're seeing so much problematic behavior in the virtual world and with games, because that's an area oftentimes where effort equals reward, and where it's kind of got a natural reaffirming component where the bar isn't particularly high, it trains you as you go along. And and except in rare cases, like you will get that positive feedback with work. And so I think, if you're talking about something that's academic, just looking into, okay, so where can we give someone that positive experience? If it's something emotional, is there something where we really can just take a baby step as opposed to a big leap, because it's really hard to jump out into that deep end of the pool, even if it is really instructive. So um, I think that baby steps are the way to go, but specifically like for any individual person, we'd probably have to scope it down a little bit.
Thank you. Another question that was shared is they love the phrase, what you permit, you promote. Can you elaborate on how that might play out specifically with substance use? And specifically you had stuff related to vaping and marijuana. Thank you so much, because potency is such a huge issue in terms of marijuana right now. Oh wait, Lisa, I wasn't finished reading the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so, and do you have specific questions about how you can have conversations about drinking and marijuana if you suspect your child is engaging in these years? And really this vaping and marijuana thing, and edibles, by the way, too, are really huge right now with our teens. Thank you.
Yeah. No, so that is a huge topic. We can dive into for a really long time. So I'll try to keep my comments brief. I think that the question of what you permit, you promote in terms of substances is that what the research tells us actually is, despite how it might look, statistically speaking, parents expressing their expectations and feelings about these topics is really important. So making sure that you have the conversation, maybe even more than once, if you hear that it's a problem, it's worth talking about it. Now, how do you talk about it and what does that look like? It's a very interesting and complex question. Principles, though, that I would go by. First would be asking your child what they've experienced so far, and recognizing as well that the traction you're going to get has a lot to do, again, with the level of emotional safety in the relationship. So again, if they feel like telling you the truth is going to come back and bite them in the butt, they're probably not going to do it. And so just recognizing that if you have the time and latitude to build up the relationship a bit, if it's not already there ahead of time, is going to give you much better results when you talk about these really challenging topics. But just asking them what their experiences are, it can oftentimes be easier also to ask about other people and what they've seen and what they see their friends doing than what they've done. That feels a lot less face threatening, because they can talk about things outside and you can kind of work your way back into where they are with it. And then in terms of specifically how you talk about these subjects, there are so many different ways to talk. I feel like this is another one of these individual questions. Like there might be some kids who respond very well to health related information. There might be some that respond better to information about how the vape and marijuana industries are honestly very predatory in how they're going after people. And is this what they really want to play into? And we've got, it sounds like you might be getting a whole presentation on this next month. I know that I do them as well, that really show how systematically these industries are actively going after young people. And I know that when I speak to high school students, one of the ways that I get traction with these discussions is before we talk about health. And I start also by saying, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just here to tell you what's actually going on, and you can make up your mind about it. Is we talk about all those economic forces at play and how these companies are trying to make money off kids because they think that they can fool them with marketing and branding. And that tends to get kids' attention, because things high schoolers want more than anything else is to feel respected and to not be taken advantage of. And so when you shine a light on and say, actually, this is what they're trying to do, immediately that changes the flavor, no pun intended, of that sort of behavior. And it's like, oh, wait a second, am I lining the pockets of people who are actually trying to basically hurt my lungs for money? And is that something that I want to buy into? That can be a persuasive argument for some as well. I think the last part that I put out there in terms of how you have the conversation, particularly to kids who might not be actively vaping, but maybe are thinking about it, is to also be honest about the potential, why people do it. Because I think kids see through it when we just say like, oh, this is bad and this is terrible and you can crash a car or have a psychotic break, or even if all of it is true, right? And we need to talk about it because they see other people doing it. And they're like, well, then why are they doing it? So we do need to talk about it. We need to talk about how socially things are really challenging right now with this in their social ecosystem. We need to talk about how the intoxication, getting high is a short-term, it's a short-term solution, but people do it because you can get high off of it. It just also can definitely hook you. And it's also really hurting your brain development when you're a teenager in very major ways. And so, as trade-offs go, if you're trying to deal with stress or anxiety or depression, there are ways to do it that don't permanently lower your IQ or change the development of your prefrontal cortex, as we're seeing in these fMRI studies. So, it's being honest with kids about it, trying to open their eyes to what's actually going on, and then giving them agency, because they're going to make decisions around it without you there. And that's when we go back to that love model and the offering, right? Like, how do you present it and how are you framing it? Trying to push like this is the right way to do it. If anything, can create that pushback, but then also when they're not under your thumb anymore, and they say, for example, go off to college where this is still all over the place, what are they going to do? And so really thinking about the long game here, and that you're really trying to equip them with the reasoning and the full understanding so that they can make decisions for themselves, is the best way to go. And the last thing that I'll mention, I know I've been talking for a while on this one, is that the earlier you can have the discussion about substances with your kids, the better. You want to be the one to set the narrative, not what they see in music videos or on Snapchat or on Instagram, because all of that is skewed. And there was actually a study that came out, I want to say it was like 4 or 5 months ago. I push all this stuff out on social media, by the way. So if you're interested in new research, please connect with me. But there was a study that actually found that 75% of substances, when substances are mentioned on social media, 75% of the time it's in a positive way, with the only exception being opioid and fentanyl. Those are more often in a negative way. But cocaine, alcohol, marijuana, and other THC products, what they're absorbing on there is that it's fun, it's okay. That's the messages they're getting. So you want to try to talk to them ahead of time about the truth about this stuff, so that they're not just indoctrinated in this self-perpetuating culture. All right, I'll put the mic down. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you so much. This is another very interesting question involving co-parenting. If your parents cannot co-parent, right, for various reasons, as there's no cooperation, how can we create this structure and stability in this type of challenging situation? Because you stressed that connection, structure, connection, confidence.
Yeah. That's a really tough question. And I would be lying if I said I have a good answer for you. I know I've worked with parents who are in that exact circumstance where there's a contentious relationship between them and a co-parent. And there's just some really, it's not like DCFS, like Child Protective Services type stuff going on, but it's emotionally neglectful. It's chaotic. It's undermining the messages that they're trying to communicate as a parent. And there's literally nothing they can do about it. And if anybody has a suggestion, I would love to hear it, because it's just really tough. What I would say though, and what I generally recommend when I'm working with folks, is just to, drawing back on the model we spoke about today, really think about what your circle of influence is. Your circle of concern includes what happens in the co-parent's house. Of course, that's in your circle of concern, but you might have zero influence over that. All you can do is create an emotionally safe and stable environment for your child when they are with you, and do your best to show them that like this is what an adult and what a parent and what a role model can be, and just be that and be as present as you possibly can, and try to also then take care of yourself and try to not worry. As you know, if there's truly nothing you can do, try not to torture yourself over it, because it is truly out of your control, and that only negatively impacts you and your ability to be the best parent that you can be. So it's really tough.
Thank you. If your child says that they have no friends, is that a red flag? And how should a parent respond to that?
Hmm. I would say it's at the very least a yellow flag. And kind of like we spoke about today, the question would be why, right? Like, is this something that is more about like a social skills deficit? Is it because they're just not in the right circles at school? Is it an anxiety problem? Is there's going to be a reason. If they want friends and they don't have friends, there's going to be a reason for it. And I think that investigating why is absolutely worthwhile. Again, I think it's such an individual case by case basis. I wouldn't want to speculate. I don't think there's a one size fits all solution, but yeah, if they're feeling isolated and lonely and alone, how can you put them into circles perhaps where they might find children who are more accepting, who share their values, who, if they're being bullied or isolated, can you put them in situations where that would not be the case?
Thank you. So I know that some parents on this call have high schoolers and some may have a combination of high schoolers and college students. Once they leave the home, right, where you can create sort of this structure, connection, and confidence, and they head to college, could you just give a few tips for parents whose kids may be struggling in college? Because they have to be the ones that go and get the help in college. It's suddenly not the parents taking those actions.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And that's challenging in a number of ways, in part because like, even if say there's like a major significant emotional concern, you can't even compel an 18-year-old to go to treatment if they really should probably be seeing a therapist or going into a program. So it becomes really difficult. I would say, depending on the situation, it can either be one where you can use the connection that you have with your child to motivate them to go seek out the resources, perhaps empower them to find environments where they can connect. The nice part about college is that it's kind of like baked into the experience. There's so many clubs, there's so many interest groups, there's so many social experiences that you could go out and do, that it's just a matter of putting yourself in those situations in many cases. I'm sure that there's some exceptions. However, you do want to make sure that they're not leaning too heavily into you, because I've seen the opposite as well, where you've got a college student who's coming home even sometimes every weekend. And so they're basically kind of like, they treat school almost like a hotel room, where they go there, they stay there for the week, they do their classes, they don't feel at home, they don't feel connected, and then they come home and it's like breathing a sigh of relief and being back in their cocoon and back in their safe space. And if it seems like that's the pattern, it's actually really important to maybe draw some boundaries and get them to connect to their environment. And that would be another example of enabling, where they're coming home because they don't have to make new connections and create a home where they don't. And so just really trying to pay attention to, are your actions prompting them to spread their wings and to fly on their own, or is it actually like a gravitational pull holding them back? And if really all they need is a nudge, or maybe just a guidance of like, where should you look to find this for yourself, absolutely try to push them in that direction.
So I'm looking at the time and I'm going to ask one more question. It's no accident that we always have our December No to Prevent be focused on teen mental health. As we're heading into the holidays, it's a very stressful time. So do you have any tips for heading into the holidays or heading into family vacations where structure and predictability go out the window? And often what's supposed to be so special becomes so stressful.
Yeah. No, actually, I published a blog post about this about a week ago. So feel free to guys to poke onto my blog for a slightly fuller explanation. But ultimately, a lot of where I think people get into trouble with stress around the holidays is that we struggle sometimes to draw boundaries with people in our family, or we feel like we can't take space or advocate for ourselves because it'll create a confrontation or a problem in the family. And so we internalize stress and we just feel bad about it rather than potentially advocating for ourselves in respectful ways, taking space, maybe even sometimes not going if it's actually the healthy thing to do. Again, avoidance is not necessarily a good option, but you have to really think about like what's healthy and what's not. I mean, I know that there's certainly plenty of times when people really find their family of origin dynamics to be really toxic and difficult. And it just doesn't make sense as a fit anymore, but people kind of like stuff themselves in it because they feel obligated to do so. And so I think just really making sure that you know what your boundaries are ahead of time, have a coping plan. So you can think of stress as a system. You've got inputs, you got to know how to deal with it. Otherwise, it just festers. So is it exercise? Is it meditation or relaxation exercises? Make sure you know how you're dealing with the stress that you're taking in, know where you want to put your boundaries, and then be okay taking space, honestly.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's okay to say no sometimes and just not do everything and recognize that people need some downtime to just recover. And our teens are under so much pressure in school and peers and everything during the school year. Sometimes it's nice to just pull in and cocoon a little bit to
Yeah.
restore yourself.
I think sometimes people confuse relaxation and fun. They're both important, but they're not the same thing. And certainly, if a family gathering is not fun, then we just need to be extra careful to actually do restorative things as well that de-escalate the nervous system and help you reset.
That Vegas nerve.
All right.
Lisa,
Well, yep. On that note,
back to you.
thank you, Dr. Weiner, for sharing your knowledge and expertise. Always a pleasure. And thank you to everyone out there for taking the time to join us tonight. I am going to quickly share the QR code for this survey again as we head out. We will be sending an email this week with a link to the recording as well as the slide deck. Many of you asked for some of the slides within there. And Dr. Weiner's email is in the chat. So if you would like to access that, that is there already. With that, I will say good night and thank you again for joining us.
And happy holidays to everybody.
Take care, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.